Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Construction Canada's webinar on helping project teams survive and thrive through risk-ready email management by Mail Manager. My name is Nithya, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. Before I introduce the speakers, please note your mics are muted. That said, if you have any questions for our speakers, feel free to post them in the Q&A forum. We will address as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. If you have any connectivity or Zoom related questions, you can use the chat feature to communicate with us, and we will do our best to help you. Today's presentation is being recorded. It will be available on Construction Canada website, so you can access it whenever you need to. Now I'd like to introduce our speakers. Jacob Wardrop, Guy Seward, and Bradley George are from Mail Manager, the email management tool developed by Arup. They work with AEC firms to improve project information visibility across project teams and ensure business continuity. Graham Brown is a partner and part of the construction law and litigation practice groups at Cassels. Graham represents clients from across the construction industry and is an expert in contract disputes, procurement issues, lien claims, breach of trust claims, delay claims, and other litigation matters. In today's presentation, the speakers will explain the role of email in project information visibility. With that, I'll turn things over to Jacob.
Thank you very much for that introduction, and great to see so many of you here. Thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to join us. So what are we going to go through today? In terms of the agenda, naturally, thank you all of you for attending. We say this for every webinar, but it genuinely is really heartening just to see so many people taking interest in the topic of dispute management. Please bear with us if there are any technical difficulties. Fingers crossed there won't be, but we do have kind of 4 presenters in 4 different locations, so hopefully there aren't any issues, but if there are, please do bear with us. So in terms of what we're going to cover today, dispute management is the theme of the session, as it says there, but how being prepared for dispute management and avoidance helps your company get ahead. I think we'll talk about kind of some of the current views on disputes, but one of the things as an industry we're going to have to face up to is taking a proactive approach to dispute management, and we're going to talk today about how that can make a material difference to your bottom line, but also additionally and equally to the productivity of your staff and the delivery of projects. We're then going to talk through the role of email on projects, and delighted to be joined by Graham, who's got lots of really hands-on experience at dealing, managing and working with companies through the various types of claims mentioned. But then the kind of final point, I suppose, is to discuss a little bit around visibility. And the reason for that is because we know as an industry we've got more risk than ever, but we've probably got a little bit less visibility than we all had when we were in one place. So really today is hopefully a kind of honest conversation with you around the dispute and risk you face on projects in terms of where that is and the steps you can take to deal with it. So we'd just like to launch a poll now on what made you attend today. There won't be loads of these, but we're really interested in kind of what makes people book on, as well as what's current and topical in the industry. So you'll receive a poll any second now, if you haven't already, with the 4 reasons for attending: either that you're reviewing IT systems generally, so it could be document management, accounts, email, health and safety. You've identified email as a challenge in the company, struggling with new ways of working because things have undoubtedly changed, or you're just interested in Arup. Interesting results, and once again, great to see so many of you taking an interest in this subject. We're going to be talking about we're going to be talking about email and the role it plays in disputes, because Mail Manager, if you haven't heard of us, we provide an Outlook add-in developed by Arup, a global engineering company, which helps companies get control of their email to make them ready for kind of anything the industry has got to throw them when it comes to email management. In terms of coming from uncertain times, it's kind of impossible to run a webinar or attend a meeting or have a phone call without the C word coming up. up. So one of the things which we wanted to talk about was how this content is even more relevant now than it ever was. So understanding contract risk on projects is a theme which everybody appreciates, I think, because we've all got projects which have probably got some contractual issues on them. We're all having to scramble about and read our contracts a lot more than we had to, but also we're probably hoping for a fair amount of fair practice across the industry when it comes to overrunning timescales. Productivity is particularly important across all geographies because most sites have been running at a slightly lower level of productivity, and this does in some ways represent an opportunity to be really analytical about the things which drain a business's time and drain a business's bottom line. And one of those things is disputes, and I think the way we think of disputes is that they're the last resort and the last line in a story, but the one thing we know is that there's far too much time spent on disputes, whether it's kind of covering your tracks or actually when it gets to that kind of last resort claim stage. And having a more proactive approach can eliminate a lot of that wasted time. Which I think was just as relevant in the old normal as it is in the new normal today. But contractual risk and acknowledging where there might be some, and acknowledging that some things do occasionally go wrong, and kind of having a bit of a look to the future in terms of what could go wrong is a really kind of important thing. Reviewing existing projects in terms of their cost and schedule is also something we're going to talk about. But the two key things really are understanding where there is contract risk, where there might be, because I think as an industry we don't always look at what could go wrong. We kind of put everything together on a bit of a shoestring and a really sort of tight program and hope that everything goes exactly according to plan, but then making that link between productivity and disputes. So being lean in a recession, we've kind of taken this from the CCA as really kind of pointing out, I suppose, drawing that link between improving your operational efficiency by addressing some of the undoubted inefficiencies. So what are they? One of them is that contracts aren't that well understood. Again, very relevant at the moment. But I'm sure lots of you on here are either running projects or have got project managers who are expected to administer contracts, but probably don't understand all of the words and all of the terms in them or how to necessarily do that. Change control has been open to interpretation for a long time. That's probably an understatement, and we know that a lot of that information is generally tracked fairly informally. But that equally, this can lead to a disproportionate amount of time being spent on disputes, whether that's a dispute which ends up in court or the day-to-day kind of disagreements which you might have when someone says, you know, where did you send that? Where have we agreed this? They're the kind of things which, as an industry, if we have a slightly more grown-up approach to contracts and trying to simplify them and making sure the people who administer them actually kind of know how to do it, and then equally that by doing that we can make a material difference to the kind of success of our firm, really. And that point around visibility is, I think, because particularly if there's any small to medium-sized businesses on there, there's terms and knowledge and kind of agreements which probably at the moment are in staff's heads or in someone's inbox. Whereas what we're going to kind of show you is how you can get that out of someone's head and out of someone's inbox into a place where you can deal with it. So on that note, delighted to be joined by Graham. I'm just going to move over to Graham's slides. So bear with me, and I'll just hand over control to Graham. But if any of you have any questions at any point, there's a Q&A feature in Zoom. So please just kind of fill out questions there, and we'll endeavour to get to them. Hi, Graham.
Well, thanks, Jacob. That was a great lead into this presentation. Thanks very much for having me on the panel today. My presentation, as you can see, is called Documents Win Disputes. And I'm sure that when some of you gathered that there'd be a lawyer speaking on this panel, the last thing you thought the lawyer would be droning on about is the most boring part of litigation, which is documents. And when most of you tune into a legal drama, the last thing you're hoping to see are lawyers poring over stacks of documents. But the reality is, in litigation, that is a huge part of it. Before you can get to the courtroom, before you can get to depositions, before you can do any of the fun stuff that people talk about and think about, you have to look at the documents. And exchanging all of the relevant documents is actually a step in litigation. And the reason for that is that documents win disputes. And the reality is, without having well-organized documents, in my personal view, you can't be ready for good project management and you can't be ready for trial. And as a construction partner and a construction lawyer at Cassels, I assist clients not only with the in-project work that they do and advice on how they can manage in-project disputes, but also with ultimately when they get into larger scale litigation. Now, if I can get the slide to switch here, it looks like we're having some slight technical difficulties. Sorry about that.
That's okay. Do you want me to move on slides, Graham?
It looks like I've skipped ahead over a few there. Jacob, are you able to move them back?
Yeah.
Sorry about that, everybody.
It's all right. So we're on documents are critical at the moment.
Yeah, so there were a couple of quotes we skipped over there, which aren't hugely important, but basically the focus of those quotes, and they were taken from sort of classic texts that lawyers learn from. Oh, there we go. One of them is that the importance of documentary discovery is difficult to overstate. And that goes back to my earlier point. Before you can get to what people in the States call a deposition and what we in Canada call an examination for discovery, you have to produce all of the documents that are relevant and material to your case. The reason that that's important is because in reality, if there isn't a document that proves that something happened, then we in law typically say it didn't happen. And so producing all of the documents that are relevant material to your case is critical for the other side to understand the case that it has to meet, but also critical for you to be able to prove your case. And the other quote we have here is, in the civil law, documents are often regarded as the only truly reliable source of information. Now, I often have people come to me and say, Graham, don't worry, I'm a believable person. The judge is going to believe me. The judge is going to like our case more than they're going to like their case. And that's great. And you may well be a believable person, but the reality is that when a judge is presented with two different stories, as they often are, what they're going to be looking for is proof that goes beyond just the oral testimony. And often what they're looking for is a document. And so one of the classic examples of this is when people don't put their contract in writing, when they're working with an oral contract. And they go to the judge and they both say, here's my version of what this contract was about. And typically what judges will do in that circumstance is they'll figure out a way to make both parties lose. Because if the parties didn't take time to actually record something, then why should they stand to benefit from what they see as being the proper state of affairs? So one of the things I often say to people is no oral contracts. But the second thing I say to people is, regardless of what kind of contract you have, make sure everything after that point is documented. Because if you document your course of action throughout a project, if you have your changes documented, if you have certain agreements on site documented, if you have site conditions documented, then when it comes to a dispute later on, we're going to be able to work with that. And so there's a number of different circumstances where I would say documents are critical. And there's a long, long, long list. But as you can see on this slide, there's a couple that I'll give you examples of today. So when it comes to the in-project stuff, this is long before you ever meet with a lawyer. I mean, you may be meeting with a lawyer about some of these things. There are a number of areas where you're going to want to be able to get your hands on your documents quickly. And so a really timely example right now, Jacob talked about the C word. I'm going to say it, COVID. And as we're working through COVID, one of the things that's been really, really important is contractual notice. And the reason for that, as many of you probably unfortunately know, is that in the CCDC contracts, there are sections that you may want to rely on. Some people have been talking about force majeure. Some people have been talking about the change in law section. And those types of sections in a contract require you to give timely notice. And if you don't give notice, your claim can be barred. And courts are actually upholding that. They're actually saying, if you haven't given notice, you lose. That's it. You are not entitled to make a claim. So when you're looking to give contractual notice, one of the things that you have to do is make sure that you've got all of your documents in order, because you may need to go look at a schedule. You may need to go find the contract, the tender documents, your supplementary conditions, and you're going to need them quickly. And I've had a number of conversations in the past few weeks where parties have said to me, I'd like to make a claim here. And I said, okay, well, how many days has it been? You had 10 days to give notice. Well, looks like it's been about 9 days, but I can't be sure. I've got an email. Where's the email? I don't know. Okay, well, can you get the contract? Well, I don't have the contract. I have the unsigned version though. Does that work? No, I need the signed version. Do you have the supplementary conditions? Oh, are those important? And so the reality is, I mean, that's not necessarily typical of all companies, but unfortunately, it's definitely typical of some. People just don't think about how important documents are until it's too late. Same thing goes with change orders and change directives. If you need to get a change order or a change directive settled quickly, you're going to need to know what your contractual terms are. So you're going to need to know where your contract is. You're going to need to know where you can find documents that may underlie that change, because as you know, changes are typically well documented. And you're going to need to be able to get it all together quickly so you can put your request in and so you can respond to the architect or consultant as they ask questions. You can imagine how those same sorts of things apply to invoicing and progress draws. And in the new prompt payment regime, which I know this is a national audience, but as an Ontario lawyer, one of the things we're talking about most here in Ontario is prompt payment and adjudication. And I've heard that for those of you in other jurisdictions, prompt payment and adjudication are coming quickly. In the new prompt payment regime, it's all about moving quickly. It's all about getting the proper invoice out there and then making sure that if you are responding to the proper invoice, if you're reviewing it, if you're deciding if you're going to give a notice of non-payment, that you know quickly whether there are any problems. And so again, you can imagine that having documents in a well-organized manner and in one place where you can find them quickly is going to be critical for your team. But when these things don't go well, when you end up in the dispute world, there are any number of pitfalls that could befall you if you don't have your documents together. So the corollary to prompt payment is adjudication. That's what happens if there's a dispute in the prompt payment process. And in adjudication, we're looking potentially at 5 days to respond. So the notice of adjudication comes, the party making the claim, party who makes the claim puts their case forward, and the responding party may only have about 5 days to pull all of their documents together. And so if you're one of those organizations that has your documents in, 60 of them at a banker's box over there, emails stored in separate Outlook boxes and everything else, it's going to be really, really challenging to pull all of those documents together in a timely manner. And you can imagine that things aren't going to go well if you don't have that level of organization. Litigation and arbitration are the same thing. There's not the same timeline necessarily, but again, going back to the documentary discovery comments I made earlier, there is a point where you need to have all of your documents ready to be produced, and you may have to keep pulling more out. Inevitably, parties, although they have an obligation to produce everything up front, will remember partway through a dispute that, oh yeah, there was that one other thing. And so you want to be able to go find that one other thing quickly. Of course, expert reports, something that many of you are probably familiar with, happen all the way through a project. The expert's going to want to get their hands on things quickly. And if you're under a court-ordered timeline to get that report out the door, you're going to want to know where the drawings are, the specs, reports from on site. The expert's going to want to see all of those things, and they're going to need them all if they're going to prepare their report in a timely manner. So what happens if you're not prepared? Well, something I often end up having to tell my clients is bad cases sometimes win and good cases sometimes lose. And I can tell you that more often than not, the reason that good cases sometimes lose is because the parties don't have the documents. And so there's been a number of times when I've had to sit down with a client and say, I believe you, your story is great. I would love to tell that story in court. But if you can't show me this email you're talking about, or if you can't prove to me in a document that this agreement that you're telling me about was reached, then the court's not going to believe me. There's a common saying in law that if it's not in a document, it didn't happen. So for instance, when I teach, as I often do, one of the things I often tell my students is, if you have an agreement on site, put it in an email and send that email. In other words, we spoke on site, we agreed that you were going to make this new entrance available to us every day, starting from this day to that day. Please confirm. Then you have a record of that. Then we can go back and we can pull that email out later and say, hey, this was a conversation that was had on site. Now, of course, sometimes bad cases win and good cases lose because judges are people and they're infallible and sometimes they make mistakes. They're not infallible and sometimes they make mistakes, but again, I think documents are a huge part of why that sometimes happens. And so what's the worst that could happen? Well, I've talked about a couple of examples, but there's a few more on the screen here that I'll just quickly touch on. If you think about, again, limitation periods, some of you may be familiar with that. At law, you have a certain amount of time to start a lawsuit. You can't just wait forever. There's a certain amount of time. And when you get close to that limitation period, if you happen to be close to that limitation period, or in our industry, a lien period, you're going to have to move really quickly. And I can promise you that one of the first things that a lawyer is going to say to you is, can you show me the documents? I need to see the documents underlying this claim so I can put your claim together. And so if you're not well organized, one of two things is going to happen. You're going to have a badly prepared claim, or you might miss the limitation period. We've talked about the notice periods, we've talked about adjudication, we've talked about invoicing and late draws, but when you get deeper into litigation, aside from just the inconvenience of not being able to pull all the documents easily that you need, there's also the risk of having increased legal fees. And that's something that a lot of people don't think about when they think about documents. I mean, sure, yeah, if I don't have my documents, my testimony is going to be more important, or it's going to be more difficult to explain my story. But another thing that you don't think about is the lawyers are going to be combing through your documents, looking for things to help them. And the more time, the more money. So it actually ends up costing more when you get into the legal process if you don't have documents. And so what we often call that process when you don't have a very well-organized case, but you're still chasing it, is you're throwing good money after bad. I mean, there comes a point when you just have to stop and say, look, I just can't prove this case. Another thing that often happens when people have documents, again, you've got a closet full of banker's boxes from 4 years ago, or you've got an unorganized email server with all kinds of different custodians holding your emails, is sometimes we have to get our law clerks and our e-discovery people involved. Because the reality is that in today's litigation, almost everything's done digitally. So if you have a wonderful banker's box of documents, we're still going to be looking to scan those. And if you have emails from a whole bunch of different people, we're going to need all of those PST files, because everything is going to be a digital document nowadays. One final thing to think about is, if you don't have the documents, how is the expert going to support your case? So if you think about some of the lawsuits that some of you may be involved in, again, I'm not assuming that everybody on this webinar is involved in litigation, but of course it's possible in the construction world that you have been in litigation before. There are lots of cases where people get sued for defects well after the normal 2-year limitation period. And that's because there are limitation periods that extend beyond that up to an ultimate limitation period, about 15 years, depending on your jurisdiction, where you can be sued for defects because they're not discoverable until much later. And so if you don't save your documents, or you throw them in a warehouse somewhere, or you destroy them, you might get sued for something on an old project that you've forgotten about. And you may have gotten rid of your documents that prove that you didn't actually do anything wrong. So what's your expert going to work with? I mean, they can look at the defect, but where are they, when they say to you, what are the specs? What was this material? Who is the manufacturer? You may not have any of that, and that could be a huge problem. So retention is important. But the other thing that goes along with all of that is just staff sanity. The number of times I have to say to either in-house counsel or senior management at a construction company, I need you to go find this document. I need you to dig until you find it. And they say, my PMs are too busy, or my people need to be on site. They can't help you. And I'll say, but we're court ordered to produce these documents now. Or if you want to give contractual notice tomorrow, I need those documents now. It drives the people on site crazy. Those people have other things to do, and they don't want to go look for documents. So again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. But to understand why people are unprepared, we need to think about what are the underlying causes of that. And I think one of the biggest ones is people during the lifespan of a project. Again, they have other jobs to do, perhaps more important jobs from their perspective. And they're going to look at this and they're going to say, it's not my job. It's not my job to put documents in the right place. If you want somebody to do that, you got to get somebody else to do it. And so just like the person who doesn't move the leaf before they paint the line on the road, you have to start addressing whether or not document retention is part of somebody's job. And so other reasons that you see people often saying, this, I can't deal with this. I can't be filing my emails every day. They'll say, I'm too busy. I just don't have time. I got too many emails from too many people. I don't have time for that. Or Well, we don't have a protocol for that. We don't have a system in place for filing our emails or for putting our documents in different folders. I have my own. I have my own folders, and that they're easy for me. Why should I have to work with somebody else and coordinate that? That's not my job. And why is that important? I don't think it's important. I mean, I have my emails, they're all in one spot. I didn't know we were going to be in a lawsuit. And so there's all kinds of reasons that I'm sure you can think of in your organization that you may end up having these problems where people are just saying, well, had I known that we were going to get sued, I would have organized everything. Or had I known that we were going to not be paid, I would have made sure I saved those things. So if you think about that and you start addressing things like, can we get some technology in place to help us with this? Or can we change our destruction of documents policy and make sure everybody buys in so that we have a problem for the future, so we have a solution for the future, then we may be able to avoid some of those problems. And so there are a ton of documents, and I've got a couple pages of them here. I'm not going to read them all to you, but there are a ton of documents that I go looking for when somebody comes to me with a piece of litigation. And as you see on the screen here, I mean, there's some obvious ones, like the contract, the supplementary conditions, the procurement documents, like the tender and the RFP. But when you start thinking about all of the different levels of documents and why they might be important to a particular kind of dispute, you start to realize it's a long list. And this is only page 1. I mean, here's page 2, it goes on. And you'll see at the end there, I've got emails, letters, and texts. Now, emails are often easy to find, although I would say that I probably have a couple of cases each year where people can't find emails because somebody's left the company. When that person leaves the company, nobody saved their emails, and tech doesn't know their password, and we can't get those emails. And sure enough, somewhere deep in those emails is what I need to prove that case. Letters, typically you can find letters. The other side may have your letters, the other side may have your emails, but one of the things that's most poorly dealt with is texts. And when you think about how commonly we're all using text messaging, even with other parties on the construction site nowadays, it gives you yet another thing to think about. So something else you might want to think about in your organization is, how am I going to preserve all of the messaging? Am I going to tell my employees, do not text? We can't save those. Make sure everything is in an email or a letter. Or am I going to say, hey, at the end of every week, you need to download your texts into a folder that everybody can access? And so when you start thinking about all of these documents, and looking at a couple more on the left there, site diaries. I mean, a lot of people have those in hard copy form. How are we going to get those scanned? How are we going to make sure that photos and videos on people's phones all end up in the same place? Because I can tell you, there are cases where the most important thing to me to prove a case is a photo of the site on a certain date. And so some of the things you're going to want to think about go beyond just how am I going to save things. Another important question to ask yourself is, why should I create things? What kinds of documents should I be creating? Should I be taking photos every week? Should I have weekly site diaries, weekly site reports, monthly? What are those going to be, and how am I going to get everybody to buy in? When are they going to be prepared? Again, weekly, monthly, daily. Why are we doing them? I think people need to understand that. I think if people understood that when you get into a dispute, or when you have to give notice, or when you have to respond to a proper invoice, there's a reason that we need these documents. I think you get better buy-in from your staff. And how are we going to do it? How are we going to create these documents? There needs to be a standard form. If you have a form that they're filling out, make them understand that they have to fill out every line. You'd be shocked at the number of times that I see change orders where at the bottom, nobody's spoken about time. It says the contract time shall be changed in the following manner, but nobody's filled it out. And then that ends up being the basis for a delay claim. After the documents are created, you need to start thinking about retention. And I've already kind of touched on that, but what are we going to retain? Where are we going to keep them? And again, I would suggest that they are constantly being uploaded or stored in an area that everybody in the organization can access. How often? Constantly. People leave organizations and they don't necessarily make sure their affairs are in order before they leave. How long are we going to store them? You should be storing them for as long as possible. If you can find a server space or hard drive space and keep them for up to 15 years, I think that would be the ideal. Retention systems. I know in my law firm, we have multiple different ways to keep documents. We have an email storage system. We have document storage systems. They're backed up. We can't delete things out of our servers. Only our IT department can. And as a result, everybody can access all of the documents whenever they want. And if I were to leave my firm, lawyers who are there after me could continue to access them. That's the kind of system you need, because again, litigation is digital. And so when your lawyer says to you, I need to find that email, you're going to want to be able to say, well, I can pull that myself. I don't have to go drive my PM nuts asking for an email. I can find that email myself right now. And how are you going to export? Again, this goes back to the legal fees question that I mentioned earlier. Often when lawyers ask for documents, they say, just give me a PST file of all of your emails. Give me a download or a hard drive of all of your documents. And so you're going to want to think about, how can I have all of those documents in a single place with an ability for me to just drag and drop or click to export or whatever it's going to be, so that somebody doesn't have to spend 2 days gathering, scanning, dragging and dropping. There could be, and I'm not exaggerating, in a construction dispute, there could be 5,000, 10,000. I've seen hundreds of thousands of documents per party that are relevant and material to the dispute that we're dealing with. So all in all, documents aren't something that you often think about when you think about the courtroom. They're not something that you think about when you think about, how am I going to win this litigation? But I can tell you, ultimately, I am always looking for documents when I talk to my clients. I'm always saying to them, show me this, find me this. And as much as they hate it, often we can sit down and settle things long before we ever have to get to the expense of a trial or potentially even oral examinations, just by saying, look, we've got the better documents. And if you have the better documents, then you can win the dispute. So that, I guess, is my brief overview, and I'll pass it back to the guys at Mail Manager, unless there are any questions. And I think there's...
Thanks very much, Graham. I can see there's been a couple of questions saying, one from Joseph, is there a stipulation for compulsory paper trails as opposed to virtual data trails for some types of documents?
So I don't think there's anything that makes paper trails mandatory. Ultimately, if you don't have certain documents, you just won't be able to prove that something happened. But the second part of the question talks about virtual data trails, and something that obviously with the advent of digital data and the focus on digital documents in litigation, something that's sort of become more prevalent is people looking at metadata. And so when a virtual document needs to be authenticated, we can have experts look at the metadata to figure out when it was created. And so in my simple example earlier at the agreement on site, and I suggested that you have the person on site on your side who reached some sort of agreement or spoke on the phone, sending an email. The reason I suggested sending an email, even if it's just to themselves, is that there's a time and date stamp, right? And so that right there locks in when that thing happened, and we know exactly when it happened, and the email can even provide more detail, in our phone call of 2 hours ago. So we see on the email that it happened at 11 a.m., phone call was at 9 a.m. And that may be critical in that dispute. So I hope that answers the question, but yeah, no, there's no mandatory paper trail.
And then the next one from Dawn. Thanks for the question, Dawn. So can a record be a PDF of an email, or does it have to be a PST file, or better still, I suppose, the actual original email?
Yeah. So I mean, ultimately, the most important thing is getting your hands on the email itself. If there's a very small production of emails that you're providing to counsel, then they may say, just give me the PDFs. But typically what we like to get is the PST file, because then we can manipulate them and organize them better. But certainly there can be flexibility depending on the circumstance. And if it's easier for you to export a large PDF selection of emails, then we can work with that as well.
Okay, and then another question just off the back of that, which is coming, saying, you indicated sharing a PST file. Is there a possibility that provides additional defense for the other side?
Well, if I'm understanding the question correctly, I think I would sort of answer the second part first, which is, can you provide additional defense to the other side? Well, the obligation in litigation is that you will produce everything that you have in your possession that is relevant and material to any of the matters raised in the dispute. So even if it's a harmful document, you have an obligation to produce it, and you're going to swear an affidavit saying that you've searched your records and you've produced everything. So to the extent that that's true, and you do produce a PST file that has emails in it that aren't going to help your case, then that's just a reality of litigation. You can't hide things. You can't, it's not like, you know, My Cousin Vinny, the movie, where he's pulling out documents in court and saying, did you think about this? Everything is known to both sides, which is why cases often settle before they get into the courtroom. So it's not about whether or not it provides more defense. It's just, unfortunately, a reality that everything is going to be produced, and PST files are usually the easiest way for us to input digital documents.
Is that kind of in the absence of them being sort of organized in a slightly better way?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we use e-discovery software. All the firms use different software, but there are different, as long as it's sort of a native file document of sorts, and PDF is one of those types of files we can use, then as long as it's organized and we can manipulate the data after we get it and see the metadata, then that's what we need.
Okay, a few more questions. Please keep them coming in, everyone. Do you have best practice recommendations for accessing and storing emails, as my business partner doesn't want to download individual client responses onto a server, as it's too cumbersome, and OneDrive doesn't allow the filing of emails. It doesn't allow the dragging of emails. She says that being able to access it and having each other's passwords should be enough. Is she right, or is there a kind of better way?
Well, I think that there may be other people on this panel who will probably give you some ideas, but I think my response would be, I think it could be better, because again, I gave the example earlier of people leaving an organization. You don't know if somebody changes their password just before they leave. Are you going to be able to get into that email account? Who runs it? So, you know, in some organizations, there's a big IT department team who can access everybody's emails, and it's no problem. In smaller organizations, sometimes what you end up with is just a couple of different people using Gmail accounts, or a couple of different people on their own computers using their own email address, and there just is no access. So my thought would be, if there was a way to take your emails and back them up every week or every couple of days into a common location that both of you can access, that would be preferable.
Okay. Yes, and we'll hopefully show something which goes some way towards addressing that. Although it's difficult to not acknowledge obvious bias. And then a further question: I tend to save my emails to a PDF and then delete the original email. Should I be keeping the original email file?
Yes, you should keep the original email file. And again, the reason for that is there could be a dispute if it was just a PDF. As to when the email was sent. Somebody might argue that it was manipulated. And I will admit to not being the most tech savvy person, particularly probably on this call, but my understanding of a PDF is it's essentially an image file of an original electronically created document. And so when you're dealing with that, you're not necessarily going to have all of the metadata that was original to the email itself. And so in that regard, the fact that it simply says sent on March 17th at 6 p.m. doesn't necessarily mean that the email was sent on March 17th at 6 p.m. It just means that that's what the image shows. And so if that becomes a critical point in your dispute, if the other side says, no, you didn't send that until the 25th, and therefore that's not proper contractual notice, and you should lose your entire case because of that, then we're going to want to be able to pull the metadata. And if you've deleted the original email, we might not be able to do that. So I would strongly suggest keeping the originals. I would even hazard a guess that the original emails might be smaller in terms of actual size, server space. So,
yeah, really a good point. That's just two other questions, and then we'll kind of move on. One of them is, you know, if you're a business owner at the moment and you're looking around your firm and you've got 4 or 5 project managers there, and you know that some of them are better organized than others, and if you were asked to retrieve all of the documentation and emails against one project, that would be probably not something which fills you with confidence. What should they do? Should they try and kind of get their house in order now, or try and put better processes in place for the future? Because you know, there's risk on existing projects before stuff comes up.
Yeah, it's a great point. I don't think there's any perfect answer to that, but all I can tell you is that if you are sitting there right now saying, we've got a problem with all of our past and existing projects. We'd like to fix it for the future because we now understand the risk that is there. I think what I would say is you may as well fix the past projects and the current projects while you're at it, because again, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. It may be incredibly painful to go through the process now of organizing everything and getting your house in order. But if one of those projects, just one, turns into a dispute later on, and you have to go get every PM to come back into the office and hook their computer up so you can search their hard drive, and then your lawyer has, you know, an extra 100,000 non-relevant documents that they have to weed out, because that does have to happen. Somebody's got to take those out, all because everything wasn't organized. Then that dispute either just became a lot more difficult or a lot more expensive. So I would suggest that if you can get somebody now to get the house in order, then, you know, it's going to be worth it, because maybe all of those projects end up being fine. Maybe there's not a single dispute to be had on them. But if one of them does go to a dispute, I think you'll be happy that you got the house in order now.
Okay, great. There's a couple other questions which has come in. We'll kind of endeavour to address them at the end. Conscious of time, so please keep putting them in, and we will answer them all. Just kind of conscious of all of the attendees. So hand over to Bradley now. So thank you very much, Graham. I think that's been really, really insightful.
Yeah, and if anybody has more questions, they're welcome to reach out to me by email. I think it was on the presentation, but it's gbrown@cassels.com. I'll do my best to answer them.
Yes, we'll share Graham's details after the webinar as well, but really, really important, particularly kind of emphasis on getting your house in order and appreciating kind of what is a record and what isn't. Because I think traditionally we've always thought that standard contract, which we start with at the beginning of a project, is like the only thing that really matters. So really helpful, Graham. Thank you. Hello, Bradley.
Hello, everyone. Thanks very much for that, Graham. Hopefully we won't encounter the technical difficulties as before, so we'll see how this goes. But onto the role of email in construction disputes. And one myth in the industry is that emails are not legally binding. And as Graham has just highlighted, you know, that simply is not true. And emails can hold businesses responsible for their actions. And in the case of a dispute or a litigation issue on a project, emails as a result more or less act as mini contracts. And we don't often realize how important emails are until we have to go back and find one. And whether this is a important business critical document during an ongoing project, or having to go back on a project that was completed some time ago to see who authorized what or who gave permission to who. You know, email is the biggest form of communication on a project, but it's the one thing that everyone tends to manage differently. You know, if, for example, you have an organized project manager who is keeping good, consistent records, a dispute could often be resolved before it gets to that legal claim stage. Okay, and there we go. Works okay. And so there are a lot of different ways of managing emails, documents and drawings, etc., in that they're often stored on a server or on the cloud. But what we find is that everyone manages information in their own way. You know, some may set up their own subfolders in their own Outlook, or you might have a shared folder structure. Some create their own rules, and some may just leave information in their inbox. And what's important is not necessarily the email itself, but the information that's contained within that email. And what can happen is that when staff go to find where that email should be and retrieve that key bit of correspondence, it's often not there. And some companies think that if it were up to their staff to file emails, then they will just simply wouldn't do it. And they may not do it consistently. And then as a result, the business is then at risk, as important information can be stuck in people's inboxes, or duplicate copies end up taking up storage on email servers. And what we find is that when emails are consistently organized across the company and important correspondence is managed in the same way, it ensures that there's that minimized risk as possible of information becoming lost. And then as a result, you're then saving more time day to day within email, and then more time on fee earning work. Okay, so have you ever been in this position? And I think it might be right in assuming that that a number of us have probably been in this in one way or another in at least one of these positions before. and perhaps you were saying it to a colleague or even worse on the receiving end of it. And the impact of getting into these situations here is that each of them in some way slows down the progress of a project, or in the absolute worst case scenario can even lead to loss of business. And when correspondence is managed consistently, that is how you avoid getting into these situations and how you can avoid being on the receiving end or asking any of these here. And it just makes your day a whole lot easier. And Arup Engineering found that they were getting into these situations quite frequently. And that is how they solved it here with Mail Manager. So just a brief bit of background as to where Mail Manager came from. Mail Manager is a solution developed internally by Arup Engineering around 10 years ago, because they knew they had a real issue surrounding email. So picture 16,000 employees, everyone managing emails and correspondence in their own different way. You know, some are creating subfolders within their own Outlook, and some just weren't doing anything at all. And as a result, it meant that not only were people wasting time on a day-to-day basis looking for key correspondence, but it also meant that Arup represented a lot of risk and a number of disputes as well, because people just weren't filing emails consistently. As a result, Arup needed something to help them manage all these emails. They thought, well, imagine if their project teams could find any email on their projects in seconds, without people having to spend any time filing. Arup looked around at what solutions were available. They couldn't find one they were happy with, so given their resources, they built their own, and they created Mail Manager. And now Mail Manager was never intentionally created to be sold, but at the time, Arup were working with a number of different companies with similar issues. And as a result, they became quite interested in Mail Manager. And fast forward to today, Mail Manager is now used by over 2,000 companies across the architecture, engineering, and construction sector. And Mail Manager is now its own separate subsidiary. That's who me, Jacob, and Guy represent. And now it's used by over 55,000 users across the sector. And like I say, over 2,000 companies worldwide there as well. So on the screen, a few of our Canadian customers have at the moment, MP Engineering and SNC are being very notable names there as well. Just take a few moments if anyone needs to make a note of them there. And on the screen there, a few of our US customers there as well. And now what these businesses all have in common is that they're all project-based businesses. They're working in high-risk environments, always looking at technology as a way of improving their day-to-day routine. And they're firms that stretch across the architecture, engineering, and construction sector there as well. And so on the screen, a few of the problems that we often come across with Mail Manager. Now, I believe we're going to be launching a poll to see what you guys think are the biggest challenges impacting the business at the moment. So is it lack of control over project information, project managers perhaps being ill-informed when making decisions if people aren't filing consistently, risk of losing information, poor visibility? I often hear staff overwhelmed by email overload, and information becoming lots of people's inboxes there as well. So I believe we're just going to have just a few seconds to have everyone decide their vote there, and we can see what everyone believes are the biggest challenges there as well. Okay, so a good bit of variety there actually, and it seems that staff inconsistent with filing information is the biggest problem there amongst everyone, and that's something that I personally come across quite frequently. And what we find is that filing information often falls on the back foot, especially when you have to meet deadlines, when you're busy on day-to-day routine. But that, as a result, can often have lasting impact if key information isn't being filed. As like Graham highlighted, when it comes to disputes down the line, it can often lead to well, maybe even becoming embarrassed in front of your clients if you can't retrieve that information quickly and efficiently. But thanks everyone for voting there as well. Okay, so I believe now I'm going to hand over to my colleague Guy Seward, who's now going to give you a rundown as to how Mail Manager works in practice and how its tools could benefit you guys there as well.
Thank you, Brad. I'm just going to share my screen. Oh, Jacob, I think you might need to stop sharing yours. Thank you. So, as I said, thank you, Brad, and thank you, Graham, as well, because I often speak to people about project emails, but very rarely a lawyer, and it's really useful insight you just gave us. Guys, I'm going to take you through what Mail Manager is. This is my Outlook, and this is Mail Manager. It's a very simple add-in. These 3 buttons and these 3 drop-downs. I'm going to take you through how I file my emails on a day-to-day basis, and then I'll take you to the search tool and show you how you can go about finding an email might have been sent ages ago, you were never involved in with relative ease. So, I'll go to this one from Aisha. Now, I don't need to reply to this email. I've already spoken to her in person. After reading it, I might move on to the next one. Danger of this being locked in my inbox remains. It's not always immediately clear and obvious what you're going to have to rely on in the future. As Graham said, documents win disputes. So I'll close it. Instead of moving on to the next one, I'm greeted with a prompt. And this is what gets me filing. This is what gets my team filing as well. This is what drives consistency. Mail Manager uses a very simple piece of artificial intelligence, which is clever, and it helps me file my emails. It's looking at where I've filed my emails previously, tells me where they should go. So it's recognized. It does also look at the subject line and body of the email to see if it can pick up any further information. It understands that I work on Gensler with Aisha, so I'll file this. That goes to 2 places. It goes to my internal server. It could also go to somewhere like SharePoint. The second place, it goes to a new folder called Filed Items. And that's so that you've got functionality in Outlook. It looks like it's disappeared. It hasn't disappeared, it's just moved. But we like to keep your inbox streamlined as a to-do list, as opposed to a filing cabinet. Now, having a look at this email from Aisha, the same person, she hasn't mentioned the word Gensler. She hasn't mentioned any project numbers, but the AI is going to pick up. That's what we work on together and help me out. I could file by right-clicking and doing that, or I could select it and file this way. What we found with these manual steps, people might not, which is why we developed the prompt. Another really important thing is sent emails. Generally, companies don't file sent emails, which are just as important as the ones you receive, if not more important, particularly if you're giving instruction on a project. So I will reply to Ben. I'll tell him to go ahead. Now, this seems like a fairly simple email. It's just 2 words, but I might need to rely on this in a year's time, might need to rely on it in 15. So I will click send, same prompt comes up, different project folder for a different person. I send and file, and that files my email from Ben and my response 2 in 1 without giving it too much thought. That's the prompt. It's very simple, very good at getting people filing. I am naturally biased, but it also represents a bit of a sacrifice to however you work at the moment and however you organize your inbox. The thing that makes it worth it is the search tool, and it's this magnifying glass up here. I've always got it open. And when I speak to clients, this is what they'd miss about Mail Manager if they didn't have it any longer. As Graham said, this is what saves staff sanity. Project managers are busy. They've got better things to do on site than scramble around their inboxes, and the search tool is what they like. It's a helicopter view of project correspondence. If you have a look in the bottom left-hand corner, I've got over 500,000 emails filed in my company. Some I'm involved in, the vast majority I'm not, across lots of different projects and clients. Let's say I had to find one email that mentioned a specific word. If I type in earthwork, it pulls up 17 emails out of 500,000. The search has been tested, works on the functionality that it can search through 1 million emails in 2 seconds, so it should never take more than a couple to find what you're looking for. Earthwork is really specific though, so let's find a more generic email. I don't know much about this one. I wasn't involved. I know it was sent in the last year. So my first port of call is the date range in the top left-hand corner. Change it to a year. So we did have 500,000 emails, and now we're down to 130,000. Still far too many to search through. The email I need was about a contract, invoice. I'll use the latter word. Stick the word invoice in there. Now we're left with 15,000 emails sent in the last year. Mention the word invoice at some point. There's an attachment. So I will click yes. We're down to just under 5,000. I know the last bit of the gentleman's name involved in this conversation. It ended in Shire. That's the one I needed. Level of project visibility that wasn't necessarily available beforehand, because you can see all of the emails on any given project rather than just your own. You might want to one day, well, I doubt you'd ever want to, you might need to one day find all of the emails on any given project. And now you've got everyone filing consistently against the same folders. You can do it really easily. So into the location, I will put our client Genza. For you guys, this would probably be a project. And I've got 1,000 emails. This is all the interaction between us and our client. All I'm concerned with is what my colleague Georgina was talking about. She was their account manager. When she left the company, we had to find out what she'd been talking to them about. We're left with 34 emails. This is all the interaction that I need when she left in regards to Genza. I know there's an attachment in the one that I'm looking for. And that's all I was planning on showing you. It's very simply a prompt to get people filing and a search tool for those times when you need to find project emails. I'll hand over to Jacob and thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks very much, Guy. Just before we move away from the software, just keep your screen on for a brief moment, just in case there's any further questions. So I don't know if anyone is wondering kind of how historical data is filed over or how you might want this set up for different people. But if there's any questions, just put them in the Q&A there. I'm mindful of time, so if none come in now, we've got a couple of questions which Graham had earlier, so we'll kind of we'll move on. So Guy, if you just press stop sharing. So in summary, why do companies invest in Mail Manager? It's really about solving problems, and one of the obvious problems which which we can't avoid is that staff do their own thing with emails. If you've got 5 colleagues around your business, you probably don't have a firm grip and handle on how they organise their inbox, because they probably do it in their own different ways. But the one thing which all of those 5 people will have in common is they've all got emails in their inbox which you might need to rely on in the future, and they probably don't realize how important those emails are until they have to go and find them. Second point is around just the ability to find any conversation on any project. So we're talking a lot about finding all of the emails against a project, but often you've got a particular issue or clause or problem on a project, leaky tap, certain level, floor of a building, and this gives you the ability to drill down and see everything, whether you've been included in it or not. And then I suppose we've talked naturally about risk, but about third point around productivity is just acknowledging how much time everyone spends at the moment on email and what an essential part of your day and productivity on a day-to-day basis your inbox is. In terms of kind of final questions, we've got a couple which have come in here, so I'm just going to ask Graham, if you're there, then there's a question which has come in here for you saying, is there a threshold that you recommend based on the value of when it would be appropriate to challenge a claim to the extent of court if it went that far? Would 100k be a reasonable threshold of the difference between the dispute, unless it may be something precedent, unless it may be something precedent setting that may be problematic for you moving forwards?
Yeah, so I don't think there's an easy answer to that question. I mean, ultimately, whether or not the wording you used there was challenge a dispute. So I assume that means you've been sued and you want to know whether or not you should defend it or just pay it out. It always comes down to a business decision. So you identified one of the considerations, which is, does this set a precedent? That may mean, does it set a precedent for my company, or does it set a precedent in the industry? And there may be good reason to challenge a very small dispute and take it all the way to trial just for that reason, because you want a decision that you can rely on in the future. But a lot of companies, implied in the question is it worth it? And a lot of companies will do a cost-benefit analysis, legal fees versus the amount in dispute versus what can be gained from this versus reputational risk versus, relationship risk with that other company, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we'll typically make a business decision at some point. So I don't think there's a hard and fast threshold that I could set for your organization without knowing more about all of those factors.
Yeah, great point. I mean, just on that, if somebody's making a cost-benefit decision on if it's worth defending a dispute, what information do they have to go off? If when they get involved with you, you're asking them for stuff which they presumably haven't kind of looked for before.
Yeah, I think that one of the discussions we're going to have is going back to the documents when disputes. What do you have? I mean, what documents can you show me that are going to help me settle this? Because the reality is that 98% of cases nowadays do not go to trial. They settle before trial. And one of the reasons that we can often settle a case, as I said earlier, is the quality of the documents. So if you can show me documents that will help me settle that case early, then we may say, look, there's a benefit to fighting this for a little while, even though the amount in dispute is small. There are other times where we say, and I have to write opinions to my clients about this all the time, I'll look at it and I'll say, look, this is a really murky dispute. The documents aren't clear. Things weren't recorded properly, et cetera, et cetera. This one's going to go for a while. The fees on this are going to be X by this point in time. Our chances of settling are low because the other party's stubborn and you don't have a relationship with them anymore. And so maybe you don't want to fight this one because eventually the cost of fighting it will exceed the amount in dispute. So that's an important conversation to have up front. As early as possible in the litigation, assess that, because it's against my own interest, but I'll often tell my clients, don't litigate this one. Let's get it settled as soon as possible, because in this particular case, that's better. And then, of course, there are the times when I say, this is a good one to fight. Let's put our foot down and let's take this one all the way. Sure.
Okay, but the decision and sort of rationale of that decision very much depends on the information available at the time.
Absolutely. Yep. It depends on the information related to the dispute, but also the information related to the company. There are times when companies say, I use that subcontractor on every job. I can't afford to fight with them and not have them work for me in the future. Or, a party looking to sue a municipality or other public body might say, I don't want to sue them because then I won't be able to get through the pre-qualification process. So there are a lot of considerations that go much beyond simply whether or not you have a good case.
Great. Okay, and then there's a further question on text messages. Basically, do they need to be retrieved directly from the server, or are screenshots sufficient?
Yeah, so I think the question there mentioned specifically the cell phone company server. And what I would say is that when it comes to retrieving text messages, that is not the situation you want to be in. To compel documents from Rogers, Telus, Bell, whoever it's going to be, usually requires a court order, which requires a motion, which is costly. So the simplest thing to do would be to make sure that everybody's backing up their text messages. My experience with my own personal cell phone is that text messages are now stored for a much longer period of time. So again, when we talked earlier about getting your house in order, something that you might want to do right now is have everybody back up all of their texts. But going forward, you might want to put a plan in place to make sure that texts either to certain numbers or all numbers are regularly backed up, and maybe that also gets into a larger discussion about personal cell phones versus work cell phones and what information is getting stored. So there may be privacy concerns that you have to think about, but I would strongly suggest that text messages be stored, because I'm finding more and more in litigation that when I get to oral examination where I'm sitting asking questions on the record to a witness and I say, okay, you keep telling me you wrote to him. Where did you write to him? They'll say, I sent a text. I'll say, where's the text? I don't know. It's deleted. I've got my phone right here. Let me have a look. No, I don't have it anymore. And so that's just not a situation you want to be in. So again, if you can figure out those privacy concerns, I think that's one of the things to do to get your house in order.
Great point. Thanks, Graham. There's a further question which has come in based on Guy's session, which was, can you file change orders, progress claims directly into our filing system, so into your own filing system, or is it is Mail Manager a repository through Outlook only? So really, where does the data reside? In answer to that question, I mean, naturally, not everyone. We've got over 100 people on this webinar. Mail Manager won't be a fit for all of those businesses, but if you are a company who currently stores information on a server or in a SharePoint type system, which is where you put your project documents and that sort of thing, and emails are dotted around different inboxes, then that's exactly why Mail Manager was developed. So the answer to the question is if the data, if you're using a server, then your emails are filed through Outlook, but they're also filed to your server as well. So you've got one place for all of your documents, emails, drawings, which is searchable. So yeah, but really, really good question. There's another question coming in around migrating historical emails. We probably wouldn't show that, Brian, but it's an important point and something which we could show to you, maybe on a further session. But effectively, there is the ability to migrate historical emails over to and through Mail Manager. So we've got many clients who will migrate tens of thousands of projects, so millions of emails in a matter of days, meaning that within a week, for example, your firm could be A, using Mail Manager, B, everybody filing consistently, and C, searching everything you've ever done for the last few years. I think there's been one other question which has come in, one question from Anita saying, thank you. So thanks for that, Anita. I'm just going to go over and see if there's any further questions on the chat. So thank you, panelists. Yep, very good. Okay, brilliant. I don't think there's any other questions really. So to summarize, just thanks very much everyone for joining. Great to see such a kind of engaged audience. I think some of the takeaways are that disputes have always happened and are still probably going to happen. Unfortunately, there's probably going to be a bit more of them, but there's also probably going to be some more frank and upfront conversations. In terms of takeaways from this, I think there's two things really. One is that we'd naturally like to show you Mail Manager so you can see on your screen how it fits in and compares to what you do at the moment. So we'll kind of be in touch with you to understand if that's something which you'd be open to looking at, to benchmark this against what you're doing at the moment. And then we've also just released a construction leaders research report, which has got over 700 construction leaders' feedback on the role email plays in their projects. So that's it. And yeah, we look forward to speaking to more of you. Thank you very much all for your time.